Fighting Through Podcast, episode 106, 10th anniversary, part 3, with more Second World War stories on the Blitz, Evacuees, Gallipoli, tanks, Dunkirk and D-day, Sappers. More great unpublished history. Our invasion is proceeding to plan, and what a plan. This is what a confident Mr. Churchill told the UK Parliament today in a brief review of the landings in northern France, which began soon after dawn. I started the engine up and checked that the floating tank screen was okay and waited. There were 4 tanks in front of me. The ramp was lowered and the first 2 tanks went down the ramp and got underway. But the third one, as he drove off the ramp, it went down like a stone. The 75mm gun is firing. The 37mm gun is firing, but it's traversed round the wrong way. The Browning is jammed. I'm saying, driver, advance, and the driver, who can't hear me, is reversing. Fast explosions rocked the airfield, and a brilliant white fire burned on the slopes of Etna. At dawn next day we stood by our trucks and moved off under a barrage. It was not easy. The enemy resisted our advance every inch of the way. Hello again, I'm Paul Shiel, and I wish you a warm World War II welcome back to this 10th anniversary party. Part 3, episode 106. And if you haven't heard parts 1 and 2, you might like to listen to them before this one. Lots of old and future favourites coming right up. And before we get into it, I've got a confession to make. When Danny Fontenot said he couldn't believe it had been 10 years, he was right, because it hasn't been 10 years. It's been 11 years and 7 months. I put my first episode up in April 2013, so blimey, next April it'll be 12 years. I don't know how I got that wrong, but it was partly because I've never really been fixated by the length of time, nor even the number of episodes, and I think April last year was when I first put the survey out, and it would have been 10 years then if I'd done the episode the following month, but time has flown, so there you go. Wow. I would like to start off by sharing another newspaper article with you. This is from the Daily Express from 1940. Just as there was fear of German invasion of Britain following the retreat from Dunkirk. Through an inferno of bombs and shells, the British Expeditionary Force is crossing the Channel from Dunkirk in history's strangest armada. Tens of thousands safely home already, many more coming by day and night. Ships of all sizes dare the German guns. Under the guns of the British fleet, under the wings of the Royal Air Force, a large proportion of the BEF, who for 3 days had been fighting their way back to the Flanders coast, have now been brought safely to England from Dunkirk. First to return were the wounded. An armada of ships, all sizes, all shapes, were used for crossing the Channel. The weather which helped Hitler's tanks to advance has since helped the British to evacuate. Cost to the Navy of carrying out, in an inferno of bombs and shells, one of the most magnificent operations in history, has been 3 destroyers, some auxiliary craft, and a small steamer. Cost to the enemy of the fleet's intervention outside Dunkirk can be counted in the shattering of German advanced forces by naval guns, and the survival of thousands of British soldiers who the Germans had hoped to capture or destroy. So there you go, there's the backdrop, and I'm just going to go through a few of the stories in this newspaper, because at that time It's interesting what was going on. There's one here, front page, same newspaper, Daily Express. 50,000 car radios to be removed. 50,000 radio sets now installed in motor cars in Great Britain will have to be dismantled soon and removed. A new emergency powers defence regulation yesterday says no person shall use or have in his possession or under his control any radio receiving apparatus installed in any road vehicle. The carrying of portable radio sets in cars is also forbidden. For the purposes of this regulation, a radio set is deemed to be installed even if it's not fixed in position, in circumstances in which it can be readily adopted for use. So I think what that boils down to is a radio can be converted into a transceiver, so it could be used by an enemy spy to send messages as opposed to receiving. So there you go. Here's another one. Food tablets ready. Concentrated tablets of synthetic vitamins similar to those issued to German troops are being manufactured in Britain. This was disclosed yesterday by Professor J.C. Drummond, scientific advisor to the Ministry of Food. The output of the tablets could be increased to any extent necessary, he said. Bomb fear starts evacuation. It was announced last night that the government had decided to ask parents in all evacuation areas, in Scotland as well as England, who wish their children to be evacuated, to register them before the schools close on Monday afternoon. It may be necessary, the Ministry of Health say, to start during next week the evacuation of school children from some of the evacuation areas. In addition to the 19 east and southeast coast towns which children will leave on Sunday, Mr MacDonald, Health Minister, in a speech said the government felt the risk of early bombing so real that they must now make as complete as possible the plans for evacuation. He appealed to parents to register their children. So, there you go. They're just coming back from Dunkirk and we're already evacuating because we think the Germans are going to invade. And that was called Operation Sea Lion, had it happened. I was going to save this little tidbit till later in the show, but I'm going to tell you now. The date of this newspaper, it was Daily Express, cost 1 penny. And the date of it was Friday, May the 31st, 1940. And of course, that's the date that Dad was brought back from Dunkirk. So in theory, he could have got this newspaper the next day and be reading about himself. How good is that? Right. The evacuations just mentioned, they were taking place well before Dunkirk, in actual fact. And what happened after Dunkirk, when everything kicked off with Battle of Britain, etc., and the Blitz? Here's a great story from the BBC People's War website, and it's written by a guy called Ken Long. And this is entitled Growing Up in London, 1939 to 45. I'm going to just share the first part of it because it's quite a long memoir. And it starts off. On Friday, September the 1st, 1939, I and many hundreds of children were assembled at Napier Road School in East Ham and marched along the High Street, which was lined with hundreds of sobbing and worried mothers. We were going to the station to be evacuated to somewhere away from London, but no one, not even the parents, knew where. I had my gas mask, a label pinned to my jacket, and a carrier bag, not a suitcase, holding my pyjamas, a change of underclothes, and some sandwiches. I was 10.5 years old, and without a brother or sister for comfort and support. The eldest child was about 14, and the youngest only 5. Some were unaccompanied too. Babies and pregnant mothers were mixed in with us, and it was a non-corridor train too. The evacuation was the greatest single movement of population in history. A decision taken only the day before, in which ultimately 3.5 million children would be taken away from their homes to avoid the inevitable bombing and gas raids we'd been told would come on the very first day. It was an astonishing feat of organisation, but certainly not perfect. Some fortunate children were sent to Canada and America, but they were certainly not from East London. Us lot were considered too lower class and rough. They were carefully selected from posh, middle and upper class areas and schools. Our train from Paddington went to Bristol, then to Weston-super-Mare. We ended up at a little village in Somerset called Uphill. There we were taken to a large school recreation field, lined up and prodded, checked for head lice and scrutinised by the potential foster parents before selection and allocation to our new billets. The best and cleanest children were chosen first. It was like being auctioned off. Some children didn't understand. They thought they'd been sent away because they'd been naughty. The foster parent received 8 and sixpence, or 42.5 pence per child per week. I don't know, $half. I was very fortunate to be eventually billeted together with another boy on a poultry and cider farm in the country, and only 200 yards from a sandy beach on the Bristol Channel. And we had a Labrador dog. Heaven! The owners were a childless couple who treated us wonderfully, Mr. and Mrs. Howe. They were very understanding. She was a most attractive and kind lady. I still visit and correspond with her at the same address. But it was a slightly different world. We found at mealtimes there were things called serviettes in rings on the table. Cutlery was arranged in a special order, and we said grace before each meal, and had 2 baths a week. We also had to go to church 3 times on Sundays, but I regard my stay with them as a wonderful period of my life. 2 days later on Sunday, we heard the broadcast by the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. By early summer 1940, there had been very few bombing attacks. The miracle of Dunkirk in May was followed by the start of the Battle of Britain. As a consequence, many children had gone back home to the cities and their parents, including me. But Germany had overrun Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium and France. Meanwhile, the RAF was still only dropping leaflets, some 6 million. They were not allowed to actually bomb German factories because they were private property. The Luftwaffe had no such scruples. They'd been developed into an excellent ground-attacking force as close support for the army. Fortunately, they'd not developed any large bombers with defensive armaments. They were just so confident that no one would stand up to them. They hadn't reckoned on the RAF and the British people. The term Blitz comes from the German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, and we were about to learn about it. The bombing of London started on Saturday, September the 7th, when 967 German and Italian fighters and bombers attacked the capital at 5 p.m. The air fleet extended for miles across the sky, and the ground shook with the noise. The main objective was the densely populated East End Dockland, including Silvertown, Woolwich, Millwall, West Ham. The prime targets included Beckton Gasworks, Woolwich Arsenal, the Docks, the Albert, Victoria, Surrey Commercial, West India and Millwall. They dropped 600 tons of high explosives and 17,000 incendiaries. The effect was catastrophic. Large areas were blown apart and surrounded by walls of fire. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees centigrade in places, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and we were sure there was worse to come. Gas. 1/3 of Britain's overseas trade passed through London docks. It was the heart of all our trade and imports, and by 6 p.m. the all clear had been sounded and survivors emerged from their shelters into the dust and smoke-filled streets. Some 1,000 Londoners were dead, another 1,600 seriously injured. The rest of us were numb with shock. Later that evening, whilst the firemen were still fighting fires, under cover of darkness the bombers again returned, guided by the burning fires, which could be seen by the pilots as they crossed the channel. The attack lasted 8 hours, while people crouched in terror in shelters, whilst an aerial pounding descended all night, the like of which we'd never before experienced, and will remain for that generation forever in their memories. Heroic rescue workers worked tirelessly to free buried people. This first big attack on London lasted 76 consecutive days and nights. Thousands were killed, injured and made homeless. Many went to live and camp in Epping Forest, and over 180,000 slept on the platforms of the tube each night. Street shelters in brick were built in the roads of residential areas, but were very unpopular due to their vulnerability to blast and lack of lighting or toilet facilities. Anderson shelters in house gardens were very effective, but were prone to flooding, dampness and condensation. By the end of the month, some 250,000 Londoners had been made homeless. After one particularly heavy attack, 1/5 of all homes were without gas or water supplies. Life became very tedious with dirt, dust and smoke everywhere. Unable to wash, cook, bath or use the toilets for days at a time. The Blitz affected all the senses, the taste of dirt, the smell of burnt timber, the artificial smell of homes with sealed and closed windows, the blackness of the blackout, the glare of flares, and the blazing orange and red skies after a raid. I can remember the all-pervading smell of dust and powdered brickwork, the crunch of broken glass underfoot, the bomb-blasted bare gardens and leafless trees as if winter had arrived too early. Another new odour was of tree sap, where all the bark had been blasted and stripped from the trees in streets and parks over large areas. You'd see a house sliced in half, as though cut with a knife. Upstairs, the floor would jut out in mid-air, still with the bed and mattress and a wardrobe, etc., and the curtains flapping away. It was like looking at a doll's house. You would sometimes see furniture thrown out of damaged homes, and it would be coated with millions of fine slivers of glass to remind you of just how lethal blast alone was. There were, of course, major raids on other large cities. like Portsmouth, Southampton, Bristol, Glasgow and Liverpool, the worst of which were on Coventry and Plymouth. These created fresh evacuations from these centres. Colchester, of course, received attention from the Luftwaffe, but they were relatively minor attacks compared to the devastating scale of the Blitz, but no less terrifying if you were a target. A major attack was one in which over 100 tons was dropped on the target in a single attack. The term bomber's moon was coined. The so-called all clear really denoted that gas had been cleared. The siren at the end of a raid really meant raiders passing. In London Zoo, all poisonous snakes and insects were destroyed in case they escaped. The morning after a raid, we'd make our way to school, noting which streets had been hit, and carefully looking for shrapnel from the ack-ack shelves. It was still very warm. This was used as a kind of currency at school, the most prized of which was a shell nose cap. Later at school, we would note that sometimes a boy would suddenly be absent. He'd be killed or wounded probably, and we'd talk about our chance of getting injured. Unanimously, boys always agreed on the part most dear to us, and it was never an arm or a leg. They didn't matter. ARP posts were constructed every half mile or so. Police stations and offices were sandbagged. Bus and train windows were covered in a mesh fabric against bomb blast. We had no sweets, no chocolate, no toys, no comics, no bananas, and no oranges. But the sky was always full of planes. It was never still. The newspapers and radio mainly reported war news, of course. Us boys all became experts in identifying all kinds of aircraft. I was even better at it than my uncle, who was a sergeant in the anti-aircraft battery. I had relatives in the Army, Navy, Merchant Navy, ATS and a NAFI manageress. Most women wore a small lapel badge of RAF wings or regimental badge of their husband, boyfriend, and these were called sweetheart badges, and they still tried to look their best in spite of clothes rationing. Everywhere there were government posters saying save fuel, make do and mend, buy saving stamps, careless talk costs lives. Is your journey really necessary? Dig for victory. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases. But never any graffiti anywhere apart from the Communists' Second Front slogans, which appeared in 1943. Meanwhile, the German newspapers and newsreels gloated over our civilian casualties and damage in our cities, safe in the belief that they would never be bombed. By the end of 1940, the German bombers had acquired a new and accurate navigation system, which meant they could home in on the London docks. In the absence of an accurate radar detection system, our gunners had to rely on the pre-war sound detection and prediction system. This relied on using sound collectors to determine the bearing and angle of approaching bombers. The Germans used to combat this by desynchronizing the rhythm of their two engines, thereby disrupting the sound detection. We always recognized it. Although radar was our secret weapon, it was still in its infancy for gun detection. Our anti-aircraft guns rarely hit anything at night, but they were a great morale booster. We felt we were at least hitting back at them when we heard them firing, The noise was tremendous, and the smell of cordite lingered everywhere, as did the dust and smoke. But they rarely hit anything in those days, firing 20 or 30,000 shells before achieving one hit. But later in the war they became far more accurate, with the aid of radar and the proximity fuse. South of London there was a continuous line of hundreds of barrage balloons as far as the eye could see. They were like great silver elephants hanging passively in the sky. There were 4,000 searchlights in and around London. Most were mounted on large lorries for manoeuvrability. The light was a very powerful beam that could reach 15,000 feet. During a raid, the sky would have hundreds of these bright fingers of light searching to illuminate a bomber so the guns could target the plane, but they mostly missed. The strain on civilians' services was extreme. The medical staff, nurses, doctors and hospitals, the fire services were magnificent and suffered many casualties. So were the ambulance drivers, both men and women. The women's voluntary service, heroines all, with their emergency washing service. And none worked harder than the ARP, the air raid wardens. During the first 22 nights of the London Blitz, they and the firemen were called out to 10,000 fires. From September to January in 1940, the city and dock areas were raided every night. This had the effect of causing the population to be constantly tired and weary due to lack of sleep. People were working every day and doing fire-watching duty at night. December the 29th, 1940, was the night of the Second Great Fire of London. It was our initiation to Goebbels' total war. No longer a war against military targets, it was now deliberately directed at ordinary people. The German General Jodl said, "Our aim is to produce a total breakdown in everyday life of the civilian population by aerial terror raids and fire bombardment." On that night of 29th of December, Air Marshal Harris, later Bomber Harris, was on the roof of the Air Ministry watching the raid. He said then, and it was only 1940, "They are sowing the wind, and in due course they will reap the whirlwind." That happened eventually to the civilians of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden and other German cities, but in far greater measure in 43, 44 and 45. Colchester Fire Brigade were there in London that night, assisting the Metropolitan and other brigades, as they'd done many times before. Essex County Standards report states that the glare from the fires in the London docks could be seen on the horizon from Colchester at ground level. I particularly remember how terribly tired everyone looked, the constant lack of sleep, the patriotic pressure to keep working very hard, the nighttime fire-watching duties and the constant stress of rationing, the blackout and the worry of what was happening to your husband, father, son, sweetheart, brother and even the girls in the services who were at risk. And they, of course, were all away and worrying about us back home. A memory that remains still very powerful to me concerns the post office telegram boys. These were lads of 17 or so who rode small motorcycles and delivered the dreaded War Office telegrams to next of kin, informing them that their loved one was missing or killed in action. At the sound of a motorcycle, you would see every front room curtain move a little, as the occupier nervously watched to see where the boys stopped, and they prayed it wouldn't be for them. It was like the finger of death for some. The stress, real stress, suffered by women in those 6 years was enormous. Many never really recovered. My best friend's house was hit and destroyed by a bomb. His older sister was left blinded in one eye by glass. Later, the family received a War Office telegram telling them that the oldest son, who was in the RAF, was missing over Germany, as was the sister's Canadian fiancé. The mother always believed for many years after the war that one day the son would turn up at their home. He never did. Black armbands were seen worn by people everywhere. Roof spaces and attics were cleared out as an anti-incendiary measure. When we had our first incendiary bomb through the roof of our house, the firemen rushed upstairs with hoses, etc., to put out the fire before it spread too far. My very house-proud mother was most upset because they didn't wipe their feet first. At work, when the siren sounded, and that was a sound like the wailing of the dead to me, employers sent their workers to the shelters, but this caused a great loss of production when a small raid would have very little local risk. So Churchill introduced the idea of roof spotters to give the alarm when bombers were actually in sight, i.e. at the last moment. Consequently, little time was lost. But most people found going to work helped to take their minds off what was going on outside. 1 in 10 bombs didn't go off, sometimes through malfunction, but mostly they were deliberately delayed or time bombs. When this happened, it caused enormous disruption. Everyone for up to a 100-yard area would be evacuated from their homes to an overcrowded rest centre. The sound of bombs falling varied from a scream or whistle to a very loud tearing noise. In a way, we were lucky, for if the Germans had developed and produced the excellent Heinkel 177, a 4-engined heavy bomber earlier in the war, London would have been totally levelled, and the war could have been lost within weeks, and London left as a pile of rubble and ready for occupation. I'm going to leave it there because that's a long story, and there's a link in the show notes if you'd like to carry on reading the rest of it and many other Blitz stories on the BBC People's War website. And as if right on cue for present times, there's a new movie out directed by Steve McQueen, starring Elliot Heffernan and Saoirse Ronan, and it's called Blitz, in cinemas and Apple TV Plus from late November. In World War II, London, 9-year-old George is evacuated to the countryside by his mother, Rita, to escape the bombings. Defiant and determined to return to his family, George embarks on a journey back home as Rita searches for him. And for everything else you wanted to know about the Blitz, check out the November the 3rd, 2024 episode of the History Extra podcast, where historian Dan Todman answers your, or at least someone else's, questions on the Blitz. That segment of the Blitz and evacuations leads me on to Kisses on a Postcard. Lots and lots of requests for this. Backdrop here. Back in episode 91, I interviewed Dominic Frisby, who's a British author and comedian, amongst other things, and by a long way, Kisses on a Postcard is one of my top episodes, covering this glorious, emotional rollercoaster musical about British World War II evacuee children meeting US GIs and beating the bombs. So Kisses on a Postcard was based on the experience of Dominic's father and playwright Terence Frisbee as one of a group of London children who were evacuated to Plymouth during the war. It follows this story with the most wonderful and dramatic theatrical production this podcast could ever hope to feature. Just to warm you up, here's the promo that I did for it.
Early on a June morning in 1940, when my brother Jack was 11 and I was just 7, we became evacuees, vackies, and were carried off to another world. It's 1940. The last soldiers have just come back from Dunkirk. The Battle of Britain's about to begin. And Britain's going to be bombed. She said, I'm going to give you a secret code. And she handed them a postcard. And on the postcard it said, Dear Mum and Dad, arrived safe and well, love Jack and Terry. And then it was addressed to her back in London. And the kids are like, what's the code? What's the code? Plymouth was famously bombed in the war. Dad was actually caught up in the bombing.
Have you got any gum, chum?
Hey, you speak American?
Give me a kiss, Minnie. Oh, Henry, give your mum a kiss before you go to work.
Over there! There's a German plane, look! It's ever so low.
Oh, God, 'tis not possible.
Janice Blake wrote in. Janice is a long-time listener and supporter. She said, Kisses on a Postcard is my all-time favourite. It offers so many moments of sheer delight. Thank you, Paul, for Kisses on a Postcard. Thank you even more for creating this podcast and this community of contributors and subscribers. Janice wrote that back in December last year, and I've been saving it till now. Anyway, as if right on cue for this episode, Janice sent me this story. Paul, when you played the Gum song from Kisses on a Postcard, I was reminded of a recent conversation with friends in Italy. My pal Anna is German. Her father was sent to Switzerland for safety when it became obvious that Hitler was taking the country to war. But her grandfather, although smart enough to protect his son, failed to protect himself. As Germany's ultimate defeat became obvious, he made the mistake of expressing his opinion. This war must stop. It's foolish to keep fighting. Too many have died already. Within days, the SS came to his house and took him away. He was shot. On a lighter note, Anna told of post-war Germany during the US occupation. Everyone wondered why the American soldiers were always eating. They kept chewing and chewing and never seemed to be done chewing. People would ask each other, what are they eating? Eventually, the German children found out, because the GIs began offering small, flat, foil and paper-wrapped sticks to them. It was gum! When my husband heard this story, he reported that US soldiers giving gum to children was still a tradition when he was serving with the 3rd Armoured Division in Germany in the late 1960s. His lieutenant would buy a huge supply of bubble gum at the stores and fill his canteen with it before they headed out on manoeuvres. When they drove through small villages, the children ran after their jeep shouting, "Kaugummi! Kaugummi!" chewing gum, and the lieutenant happily responded to their calls, tossing gum to them by the handfuls. Janice, thank you so much for that. What a super story, and what a great way to introduce the next segment. This sequence, well, it actually needs no introduction, even though I've now effectively given it one. It illustrates how the evacuees begin to interact with the American soldiers.
There, kids.
Well, hi there, kids.
How you doing?
She was right. They are all black.
All right, I will. Have you got any gum, chum?
Hey, you speak American?
That American?
You dig?
What?
You talk the jive, Clive?
My name's not Clive. It's Alan.
We kids, we loved them. We wore their hats, chewed their gum, held their strange hands and ate their candy. We rode on their jeeps, tooth-loosening joyrides across the fields. We drilled with their rifles and learned their slang. I even had a tap dancing lesson on a sheet of plywood at the army camp gates from a man from New Orleans itself.
Hello. How are you? Good day. We're soldiers from the US of A. Pleased to meet you, sir. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Pleased to meet you, pretty lady. We're here for Uncle Sam. At your service this fine day. Any questions? Please just say.
Questions? Loads!
What's it like in the States? Is it just like the flicks? What's the weather like? Have you flown in a plane? Are there cops and robbers? Are there gangsters too? Are there cowboys and Indians? Do you know John Wayne? Have you ever seen a puma? Have you eaten a satsuma? Do you like hamburgers? Do your cows go moo? Have you crossed the Mississippi? Have you caught a barracuda? Have you been to Colorado or to Kalamazoo? Have you got puffs?
No, we have bars.
Do you catch the bus?
No, we all drive cars.
Have you ever had a pasty?
No, we have not.
Is it true that you eat dogs?
Only if they're hot.
Have you crossed the Golden Gate? Have you climbed the Empire State? Have you ever smelt a skunk? Why'd you call a tramp a bum?
Do you have steam trains? Can you tell me, chum?
One last question. Have you got any gum? Got any gum, chum?
We might have some.
Any gum, chum?
Now don't all scrum.
Any gum, chum?
It sure is yum. You can chew it till your mouth goes numb.
Got any gum, chum?
This sure is fun.
Any gum, chum?
Do the chewing hum.
Yummy, yum, yum.
Rum pum pum.
And that is how you do the chewing hum.
We've got snakes and alligators and our own refrigerators. Oranges and peaches, eagles, buffalo. Bears and avocados, a city called Chicago. Frightening tornadoes, tropics, desert and snow. We've got rodeos and ranches, grapes upon the branches. We drink lots of Coca-Cola and there's ice to crush. We've got Mormons, we've got Quakers, we've got towering skyscrapers, but no privies for us. Our lavatories flush.
Do you drink tea?
No siree,
Speak Cherokee?
not frequently.
Do you play billiards?
We shoot pool.
Would you like a game of cricket?
We don't understand the rules.
Do you know Clark Gable? Is Harper really dumb? Have you ever had a Hershey? Have you hit a home run? Please give me an answer. Can you tell me, John? One last question. Have you got any gum? Got any gum, chum?
We might have some.
Any gum, chum?
Now don't all scrum.
Any gum, chum?
It sure is yum. You can chew it till your mouth goes numb.
Got any gum, chum?
This sure is fun.
Any gum, chum?
Do the chewing hum.
Yummy, yum, yum.
Rum pum pum.
And and that is how you do the chewing gum.
Kisses on a Postcard, episode 91. For those who dearly wish Kisses would come to a theatre, for now you can at least see an early theatrical production, 20 minutes of highlights from a 2011 production at the Queen's Theatre, Barnstaple. That's on YouTube, and I've put a link in the show notes. And the links include some moments from the Abbey Road sessions recording the Kisses on a Postcard podcast. And you can watch the performers perform live during COVID to get this podcast show on the road with a super medley of some of the best bits. So look through the show notes for the links. I've tried to put them in a prominent position. And don't forget, you can get the full performance of the Kisses on a Postcard podcast on any podcast player. Over to a few reviews now. Dave Thomas from Oregon said, Paul, there are no words that I can express my gratitude for your hard work and devotion other than thank you. Our fathers would be proud of what you've accomplished by bringing these personal war stories to the public's attention. My dad would tell me that I would never understand what it was like. Your stories shine some light on what those men and women went through, and I'm grateful I never had to experience it myself. Warm regards, Dave Thomas from Oregon. Greg Madill from Toronto, Gary Hall, Pennsylvania, Steve Hunt, New York, Lee Owen from Bridgend, all expressed a preference for Dunkirk, The Bee, Gallipoli, Fred Reynard, etc. And Ross Moore from Canada said, I've listened to Fred Reynard's Gallipoli episodes more times than I can count. I absolutely love the way he describes the scenes. He often has me scrambling for my imaginary Lee Enfield and bayonet. Okay, thank you, chaps and chapesses. In chronological order for this character, here we go. The memoirs of Fred Reynard, Rifle Sergeant at the World War I Battle of Gallipoli. This private unpublished memoir was sent to me by Helen Westbrook from the Isle of Wight near Southampton in England. The memoir for me started off as a faded photocopy of a handwritten diary, and it's probably the longest I've ever taken to produce an episode, apart from the last couple maybe. And it was a fine example of great unpublished history. Here we go. In 1915, British, Australian, New Zealand and Indian Gurkha troops fought for the strategic waters of the Dardanelles and the Turkish capital city of Constantinople. A leaflet issued to troops advised Turkish soldiers, as a rule, manifest their desire to surrender by holding their rifle butt upward and by waving clothes or rags of any colour. An actual white flag should be regarded with the utmost suspicion, as a Turkish soldier is unlikely to possess anything of that colour. Would the brave but overconfident Allies find they'd bitten off more than they could chew in the face of opposition from the equally brave, confident and well-prepared Turks? I'm now going to give you one of the most exciting battle descriptions you could hope to hear. The Allies have landed at Suvla Bay, and their mission is to cross the landmass to get to the waters of the Dardanelles, and there's just been a firefight as a prelude to battle. Then the firing stopped, and with a yell of Allah, Allah, the Turks charged. They bore down on us like fiends, and soon I was fighting for my very life. For over an hour, the enemy sent everything he had, large and small, and the very earth seemed to rock with explosions. We had a few near misses, and a few were hit where we were, but it was the wood that had it. Suddenly the shelling stopped, and there was a great yell as the Turks charged from behind the barrage. They came in swarms, shouting and cursing us in broken English, calling us infidels from the South Seas and from the accursed Britain. They called to their Allah and shouted that they would drive us all into the sea as they swarmed through that gap in the wood. Belt after belt I put through that gun. His dead piled up, but over the bodies they still came, shouting and cursing. Still nearer they came. We fired point blank, and they reached our trenches, piling up their dead on the parapets. And then they were amongst us, and a free-for-all followed. We fought with everything we had: butts, bayonets, entrenching tools. Kill or be killed was again the order. We drove him into the saps we'd dug, and a Mills bomb sorted him out. Then a welcome cry from behind us, and the little Gurkhas came. We didn't know they were around, but we heard they'd come over from Lola Barber to our left. Their knives flashed out as they got among the Turks, and the slaughter began. Slowly, Johnny was forced back, leaving only behind his dead and wounded. By dawn it was all over. The Turks had retired, and their wonderful army of 20,000 smashed. He lost nearly a quarter of his strength, between 7,000 and 8,000 killed and wounded. Do you want more? Oh, go on then. This is Fred's first-hand memoir of World War I Gallipoli continuing. Further on over the hills, this is. 4 miles, yes, 4 little miles, lay between us and the water of the Narrows, and that would finish the Turks. Then all the hardship suffered, loss of life and limb, which we'd endured, would not then have been in vain. But it was not to be, for there were 2 more summits to be taken. And Johnny didn't wait for us to get to him. He came to us in the dark. Yard by yard we were forced back down the slope we'd fought so hard for, back under the pressure of overwhelming numbers. Our flank was shot to pieces, so we within the front got it always. Bombers and snipers were all thrown into the fray, and we could only go back to where we started. There we rested and licked our wounds, and Johnny his. And we settled in, but after 3 weeks we were on our way again, this time to Shrapnel Valley. We took over trenches in good order and fairly deep, running across the brow of a hill. Behind us on the slope were scores of dugouts, the best, and as far as we were concerned, the only one we had seen, and there was a good gun position, well protected. The Turks were on a hill or hills that zigzagged away from us, the nearest being about 500 yards. A deep valley ran between us, thick with dry gorse and winter strawberry bushes. This valley he swept with shrapnel during the day and sent out an army of snipers during the night, and woe to anyone who wanted to look around during the night, for he had an uncanny way of seeing in the dark. We were comfortable for about a week. Then one night a patrol of his got close enough to throw a bomb in our front line trench not far from us. We put up a star shell, and we saw the patrol making their way back to their lines. The star shell lit up the valley long enough to range on them with the gun and shatter them, and then we were quiet. The next morning, bang, and a whiz-bang shell burst overhead, wounding J. West and C. Knight, the ship's captain and mate of the Wave, whom I was working with when the war started. I slipped down over the bank to help them and had just cleared the ridge and another shell, but this time a direct hit on my gun. I never saw a part of that gun again, not even as big as a sixpence, and there was little left of the two men who were sitting there by it. The enemy had spotted the flash the night before and silenced the gun forever. This ended my army life as a machine gun sergeant, for there were no replacements, so from then on I was number 4 platoon sergeant. Another 2 weeks and another move, this time towards Achi Baba, a high towering hill, and we took over a section that the Australians had taken named Russell's Top. This was a flat top of small hill, and between us and the Turks' lines was a large strip of land which we could look down on and command a large open space. The space was thickly covered with gorse, and huge rocks stood out like sentries. Good cover perhaps, but for whom? For the place was alive with snipers. These snipers proved a menace to everyone. We could scarcely move in daylight and feel safe. Every day they claimed their victims, and things began to get serious, as we were all tied down, it seemed. One day I had to report to Company HQ. There I was detailed for a patrol to go out that night and try to locate and dispose of some of those hidden Turks. The patrol would be formed from my platoon and would consist of Lieutenant James, 12 men and myself. If we could secure a prisoner, it might be helpful, but clean out some of those thugs were the orders. At night we set off on our job, and to be honest I had the wind up, although I mustn't show it. We'd blackened our faces and went through a gap in the wire on all fours. Our lieutenant led the way and I made the halfway man. No noise was made, and we carried on for about an hour, then rest, and watching like cats after a mouse. The night wore on, and we made no contact, and things seemed strangely quiet, when suddenly we received a signal passed back by our officer. He'd come up to 2 large rocks, and we had to crawl up to them. We came up, and what a hiding place for those 4 murderous thugs. We were on them before they knew what hit them, killing 2 and knocking 2 out. There was rum in a jar, and I think they'd had some, which made them less alert. Their faces were painted with a colouring to suit the surroundings, and there were ample supplies of dates, figs, water and ammunition. Yes, they'd come to stay. Well, we had a conference, the lieutenant and I was told to get the 2 still alive back to our lines if possible. I took 4 men with me and started off. It was no joke hauling those senseless dead weights back over no man's land, over potholes and the wreckage of men and material. We couldn't do it without making a noise, and that brought sniper fire. When they came too near, we used our prisoners as shields, but progress was very slow. Orders had been issued that there was a sniper's patrol out, but it was necessary to return to the same part of the line we'd left. There was always the chance, too, that a nervous dope would let go a round or 2, and with a bad light a yell could be fatal. I found it very difficult to get contact with our lines. So, finding a suitable cover for my party, I decided to go on alone and warn the sentries and get some sense of direction. I carried on for a while, and I thought I could detect the dark outline of our trenches, and started to make for them, and then someone opened fire. I wondered what he saw, but he did bring back the sniper's yapping, and then I realised that a sharpshooter had spotted me. There was a dark object ahead of me about 10 feet away. I thought a rock and shelter if I could reach it. I moved a little with caution, and a bullet hit close to my head and filled my mouth with earth. He had the range right enough, and it seemed to me that all that remained was the one with my name on it, if he had it. I dare not move, and I went hot and cold in turns. Another bullet hit close to me, and I knew he had no intention of letting me reach that shelter, and he was playing with me. I grabbed the earth and lived an eternity those next few minutes. Then I could stand it no longer, and I jumped up and made a flying leap for that shelter. A hail of bullets followed me, and I dropped behind the mound and couldn't move. I fancied I was hit, yet had no pain. I lay there. No, I wasn't wounded, just scared stiff, and then I looked about me and saw that the mound wasn't rocks, but 2 Johnnies swollen up in the sun. The position they were in gave me the impression that one was carrying the other when they fell. Yes, 2 dead Turks for company, and if anything smells worse than those 2 did, I am yet to find it. I lay there as sick as a dog as bullets hit those bodies, but I dare not leave them, for that would be fatal. So, stench or no stench, I had to stay, for I was alive and wanted to stay that way. But I was afraid of fear, for I wanted to get up and dare not. And I tried to pretend that damnable odour wasn't getting down my neck, but it was. The night wore on, and then suddenly the firing ceased. I waited. Nothing happened. I stared out into the darkness and thought out my next move. The sniper was still silent, and I began to wonder if one of my patrol had caught up with him. And then I moved forward and tried to get my bearings. I found myself on a burnt-out patch of gorse, and what I'd thought was our trenches was tall bushgrass the fire hadn't touched. Try as I might, I couldn't determine my position, so I was in no man's land, hopelessly lost. If you want to find out what happened next and need something to get you through a long journey or a night shift, check out episodes 16 and 17, Gallipoli. I've mentioned several times that all these episodes have links in the show notes, and I think I'll point out that there is an episode shortlist on the menu on the home page of the website, and that's got all the episodes listed in numerical order, and it's not that difficult to search for particular subjects you're interested in. And for that shortlist, there's a link in the show notes. Well, Fred survived that battle and went on to a peaceful life as an engineer aboard kind of little ship the Bee at Dunkirk. And it's by no means a minnow, and is in fact a 70-ton coastal transport boat with a decent carrying capacity. So fast forward to May 1940, and the ship with its crew of half a dozen are commandeered by the Royal Navy to help evacuate Dunkirk. And they've just arrived at Dunkirk, and Fred has written his second memoir of his life in action. At this point, of course, he's an engineer on the ship. He's not a combatant. 0 hour was dawn, 3:30 a.m. Sleep was out of the question, and we busied ourselves hanging a scrambling net over the bows. Dawn finally broke. We raised anchor and made for the shore. What a sight met our gaze! The sea was covered in oil, and there was wreckage everywhere. The docks were burning, as were huge oil containers, and over the town of Dunkirk was a pall of black smoke. The shores were a sea of human beings, and there was a constant stream of men coming over the dunes down to the water's edge. We were now nearing the beach. Another near miss. No one could be lucky enough to survive this holocaust. Now a welcome sight. 9 of our fighters arrived, and straight into the Huns they went. Easy targets, those dive bombers. Some scattered and fled, some went down. Our planes could not remain long, and back came Jerry with his unceasing bombing. But still that procession of men came down to the water's edge. There was nowhere else to go. Cars, lorries and motorcycles were being sabotaged by being driven into the sea or destroyed on the beaches. A lone chestnut horse ran up and down the beach. More RAF planes arrived. One crashed on the beach, but with more of our planes, what a different story it would have been. B drove at full speed onto the shore and grounded. They came towards us, some wading almost to their necks in the water, those men of the BEF, and we realised that our efforts to assist them aboard with ropes and scrambling nets were futile. Waterlogged and utterly exhausted, many wounded, it was impossible for them to make such an effort. We quickly sawed the ship's ladder in 2, placing 1/2 on each side of the bow. The success was reward enough to see these men file aboard, some equipped with nothing but a covering of clothing, but all with the determination to live. Fast forward to the end of that adventure, and Fred describes, we finally pulled away from the beach for the last time of many and were ordered to continue with our human cargo to Ramsgate. It marked the end of the most unforgettable 24 hours of my life. We reached Ramsgate and tied up to discharge our troops amidst expressions of gratitude, not solicited and better left unsaid, for simple thanks could move us to tears in the wake of this experience. The stronger helped the weaker up the gangway, and they were met by ladies with cups of hot tea, cakes and cigarettes, while the Red Cross were there to take charge of the wounded. So that other vessels could make use of the landing facilities, we moved B into the middle of the harbour, and the telegraph finally rang, finished with engines. I went upon deck, lay down on a folded canvas, and as sleep overcame me, I remembered a lad who'd earlier knelt by the engine room hatch and recited the Lord's Prayer. That's episode 11, The Bee, if you want to follow that adventure in full. And now I've got a seriously spooky reflection on all of this, because Fred later wrote his memoirs, and it's only because he'd heroically survived Gallipoli in the First World War, and then obviously survived Dunkirk in the Second World War. And coming next is probably the most scary, spooky story I've come across throughout the whole of this show, in all 100 odd episodes and beyond. For we now know that even before World War I, Fred Reynard had already diced with death. In 1912, 2 years before World War I, he'd left his home on the Isle of Wight to start a new job. as a stoker on a passenger ship. But evidently, heavy fog in the waters of the Solent held up the journey to Southampton, and the ship left without him. So Fred Reynard, hero of Gallipoli in 1915, and engineer on board the valiant Dunkirk Ship B in 1940, only did those things because he escaped what would have been the first, fateful and final voyage of a ship called the Titanic. And that story, dear listener, was only heard by you because Helen Westbrook shared it with me. You heard it on the Fighting Through podcast first. Wow. From horror to humour now with Stan Perry, and first a funny story about armoured fighting vehicles, AVFs. Listener Gabriel Cervantes sent me an insightful message as to how it was to fight in one of these things. And this description was posted on an armour webpage for Fort Benning, Georgia, USA, and it's entitled The Reality of Fighting in Armoured Fighting Vehicles. Or tanks, really, I guess. The 75mm gun is firing. The 37mm gun is firing. But it's traversed round the wrong way. The Browning is jammed. I'm saying driver, advance on the A set, and the driver who can't hear me is reversing. And as I look over the top of the turret, I see 12 enemy tanks 50 yards away. And someone hands me a cheese sandwich. And that's from a British tank commander in the Western Desert, 1942. And I'd love to know what the late Captain Stan Perry of the Sherwood Rangers would have made of this. I so wished I'd had it to hand when I interviewed him back in episodes 36 and 37. But talking about Stan, here's just one example of his humour.
Well, the weather turned pretty foul about the middle of July, I think it was. It would be about the middle of July, I think. We got some pretty foul weather. Jackie Holman went into action.
This is your commander?
With an he was my squadron commander. Yeah. He went into action with an umbrella up. I wasn't getting rained on.
I can hardly hold the camera still.
That was Jackie Holman.
He didn't get shot then?
No, he got away. Well, as I say, a lot of the time we went into action, head and shoulders showing, and just wearing a beret.
Yeah. David McNulty from Wicklow in Ireland wrote in and said, Stanley Perry, when a man like him walks into the room, don't run. Here's a clip from the interview I had with Stan in episode 36. And this is the more serious side of him. What was the closest you got to killing an enemy, or closest distance-wise? Because obviously, from what you've been saying, you did have some fairly close quarters.
Well, the closest I did shoot a German at about 3 yards.
Pistol?
And that was while I was in the tanks, and I did a little recce into this house. I was worried about passing a house that they could chuck bombs down from the window.
Yes.
And if you hadn't got your lids closed, you might be the recipient of a grenade. So I sometimes do a little foot recce. And I went into this place, and there were 3 Germans sitting there. And I kicked the door open.
Yeah.
And I said, Handy Hock, or something like that.
Yes.
And the first one with his hands up, I shot. I'm sorry, that was why I brought up.
Yeah.
The one with his hands up first is the big danger.
Oh, really?
Because he's the quick reactor.
Ah, okay.
And he's the one you shoot.
And then the other two come quietly.
And then the other two, and so we took the other two prisoners. I think there's 3 scars you bear from war, you see. There's the scars of the mind, whether it's proper to go out and aim to kill or maim or shoot a fellow man, and you overcome that by the necessary need to combat the evil of Nazism and German aggression of the time. That's one scar. Physical scars you might get from being wounded or blown about. Not too bad with modern medical science.
Yeah.
But then the worst scars to bear are the scars if you bore some level of responsibility, whether it's Lance Corporal or General Officer Commanding in Chief. The thought that you led friends and comrades into risks of death or serious injury, you had that responsibility.
Yeah.
And you think sometimes, had my judgment been better, had I done the right thing at the right time, they may not have been killed. War is like that. You have to make decisions at a moment's notice with a minimum of information.
Yeah.
And if you get half of it right, you're probably doing fairly well.
That's the late Stan Perry of the Sherwood Rangers. And talking of the Sherwood Rangers, this is an unheard account of D-Day written on the actual day by Trooper Ernest Thomas, a tank driver in C Squadron Sherwood Rangers. And I found this on the Sherwood Rangers Facebook page. Ernest wrote the memoir while his squadron lagered up for the night of 6th of June, that's D-Day, outside of Bayeux. Lagered up has nothing to do with Tenant Spear, by the way. Trooper Thomas would be wounded at Rauray 3 weeks later. So this is Gold Beach Red Jig sector. 1st of June 1944. Well, survived the first day. Lagered up for the night just outside Bayeux as I write this. We had a terrible crossing. Nearly everyone was sick. I thought they'd face anything Jerry had to give us as long as they got on dry land. We arrived offshore at 7:30 a.m. There was all hell let loose. Our battleships were pounding away at the shore. The rocket ships setting rockets off continuously like a machine gun. There were ships as far as you could see, still firing to the shore. The sea still very choppy. The order came over the tannoy to prepare to disembark. I started the engine up and checked that the floating tank screen was okay and waited. There were 4 tanks in front of me. The ramp was lowered and the first 2 tanks went down the ramp and got underway. But the third one, as he drove off the ramp, it went down like a stone. His screen must have collapsed. The crew managed to bail out and were pulled aboard. The next one got off all right. Then I got the order to go, took it very steady and cleared the ramp, engaged the propellers and got underway okay. As we neared the beach, I saw the tank traps we'd been told about, steel girders crisscrossed with mines attached. The engineers and frogmen had blown some up and left gaps for us to go through. The tank on my left hit one and blew up. I felt the tracks touch the beach, so I disengaged the propellers, put it in gear and dropped the screen so the guns could be used. But just as I got clear of the water, the tracks got bogged down in the soft sand and I couldn't move. We stuck there with HE shells landing all around us. Then about 2 p.m. it quietened down and one of our recovery tanks winched us out. By now the beach is swarming with men and all types of vehicles. We contacted our squadron leader and told him we were mobile again. By this time, they'd pushed inland. We got directions over the radio where to find them, and found them okay. Then we advanced a few more miles. Bob, our gunner, bagged a Jerry half-track and a machine gun that was keeping our infantry's heads down. Before it got dark, we could see our first town, only 2 or 3 miles away. Still shelling us, so we won't get any sleep. We'll be moving at first light. Just heard we lost 7 tanks in our squadron in the landing. D-Day has had a lot of coverage recently, so I'm not going to go over too much old ground. First thing I'm going to do, though, is read the newspaper from Tuesday, 6th of June, 1944, the Evening Dispatch. So excuse any crinkles and wrinkles and shuffles that you hear, because this is the real newspaper I've got in my hands. Unbelievable. So here we go, Evening Dispatch, Tuesday, 6th of June, 1944. And it's 1 penny, the cost. It's interesting what things they told you, little bits of information in the top at the masthead. It tells me that the blackout is from 11:10 p.m. to 5:02 a.m. and the moon rises at 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. Tells you that radio is on page 3. No TV in those days. And interestingly, there's a thing in the centre, more or less. It says code letter for tonight. A, big capital A. And I just wondered what that was. And I found out. And I'm going to tell you in the PS. So keep listening. Here we go to the headlines. Invasion going well. Tanks ashore. Allies have foothold, slashing inland, all to plan, and what a plan. 11,000 planes and 4,000 ships engaged. Then the narrative is, our invasion is proceeding to plan, and what a plan. This is what a confident Mr. Churchill told the House of Commons today in a brief review of the landings in northern France, which began soon after dawn. An immense armada, upwards of 4,000 ships, with several thousand smaller craft, have crossed the Channel, sustained by about 11,000 first-line aircraft, disclosed the Premier. Massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the German lines. Landings on the beaches are proceeding, and the fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled. Obstacles which the Germans had constructed in the sea have not proved to be as difficult as was apprehended, concluded Mr. Churchill. Hitler concludes the correspondent is believed to have moved his HQ to a place somewhere behind northern France. And a Reuters message from a US photo reconnaissance base this afternoon says the Allies have established beachheads in northern France and are slashing inland. Washington announces that specially trained and picked assault teams of the US Army made the initial attack, knocking out pillboxes and other fortifications. And at 9:33 a.m, Number 1 communique from Supreme HQ Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, told the world that the great day had arrived in these words. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. It's full of stuff. The greatest air fleet ever to assemble for one operation, and probably outnumbering the Luftwaffe by at least 3-1, is covering the invasion, says an air correspondent. During the night and since the landings were made, Allied bombers and fighter bombers have been pouring thousands of tons of bombs on the enemy positions. That's brilliant. Can you imagine reading this after sort of 5 years of war and suddenly we invade? This article continues. The biggest minesweeping operation in history, which paved the way for our landing craft, involved 70 miles of sweep wire and 10,000 officers and men. That's just the minesweeping. SHAEF states that more than 640 naval guns from 16 inch to 4 inches are bombarding the beaches and enemy strong points in support of the armies. Our Allied landings, it's understood, in London were made in Normandy between 6 a.m. and 8:15 a.m. Naval bombardments in which US ships took part were carried out and airborne landings made, first reports being described as good. For 3 hours before General Eisenhower released the momentous news, German radio stations had been reporting the invasion, with long accounts of battleships and destroyers off the mouth of the River Seine, airborne landings in Normandy, and air attacks on the vital coast around Cherbourg. Let's have a look at another good bit here. Robert Rubin, Reuters special correspondent, was due to go into Europe in one of the leading planes in the Air Force units. He tells of last-minute scenes among the parachutists in a dispatch sent from the field of departure somewhere in England. Vast numbers of paratroopers, airborne pilots, glider troops and other personnel have been sealed in this airborne area of England, he writes. They're completing last-minute preparations. Everyone is now briefed. And the briefing is, "You have given your commanding officer grey hairs trying to keep you out of the guardhouse," the commanding officer told his troops. "But this is one night when I want you to raise all the hell you can. I want you to go through your area, tearing up and blowing down everything you get your hands on. You'll be dropped on the back of the Boche. I know you're going to strike terror in his heart." Before the assaulting troops embarked, each man was handed a copy of a stirring order of the day, in which General Eisenhower told his men that the eyes of the world were on them, and that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere will march with you. "We will accept nothing less than full victory," added the Supreme Commander. "Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking." A German radio commentator described Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol, Hull and London docks as the springboards of invasion. Not Southampton, then. General Montgomery, who's in command of the land forces of British, Canadians and Americans, was in confident mood when he talked to correspondents on the eve of the landings. According to Doone Campbell, Reuters correspondent, the party, he said, is in first-class shape to win the match. I don't know when the war is going to end, but I don't believe the Germans can go on much longer with this business. Just one little footnote here. 8 days rations, the heading. Food provisions for 8 days plus 1 day's emergency rations were put aboard the landing vessels. Each man was issued with a day's emergency rations for the first day's operations until field kitchens will be in operation. Right, I'm going to move on from that. I hope you enjoyed that little insight to, up-to-date news as it was happening. I think it's a refreshing angle from the history books and the memoirs. I'm going to now move on to a memoir from Dick Bowen. And for some reason, this one really made my hair stand on end. You've heard it before. And this is from the D-Day Battle for Europe book by Molly Burkett and Dick Bowen. It's a book of assorted memoirs revolving around D-Day. Link in the show notes. I'm not going to give you the whole story because you've had it before in episode 45. But this is just a little taster from it, how it begins as regards Dick's adventure himself. So here goes. This features Dick as a 5th East Yorks landing on Gold Beach. They brought the 50th Division, that was Dad's division funnily enough as well, back in 1943 from the Mediterranean. They were hardened soldiers. They'd been fighting continuously for 4 years, and I wanted to be one of them. But my requests were turned down. I went and saw our Sergeant Major, Squeaker Bennett. He had a face like a pickled walnut. He listened to my request and handed me an envelope. I could put my corporal stripe in there if I really wanted to go, because I would be demoted to a private. He didn't think I would do it, but I did. I was posted to the 5th Battalion Holding Company in Aldershot. That's the 5th East Yorks. We were loaded in lorries and taken to Canning Town in the East End of London and pitched our tents in empty, bombed-out streets. I've never seen such devastation, yet people were living in these broken shells of houses. Then a heavy fence was put round the camp, and we were shut in. Redcaps appeared to guard the camp, and we were paraded and told we must not talk to anyone outside the camp. We were also told that the second front was about to start. We weren't told where it would be, but we knew it was France. We were paid in French francs that had been especially minted for the invasion. Listen, I've still got some of those French francs that my dad had in his souvenir box. 3 days later, we were paraded with full kit and marched down to East India Docks, where we boarded an old peacetime troop ship. We set sail almost immediately. As we passed Southend Pier, one of the men jumped overboard and swam for it. We all cheered him and carried on cheering long after he was lost from view. We were anchored out at sea for a week, and we were bored stiff. One morning an elderly officer came on board. He'd been in the First World War and wore a military cross, amongst others. 8 of us were to be transferred to another ship. The old officer watched us leave with tears in his eyes. I realised long afterwards that he thought he was sending us to our deaths. We reached an LCI, landing craft infantry, with assault crafts slung over the sides where one usually saw lifeboats. We clambered up a rope ladder and were welcomed by the CO, Colonel White. He told me I'd be in Sergeant Mayhew's platoon, and he arrived almost immediately. He took me below and handed me over to Corporal Stevenson, who told me I would be a rifleman in his section. "Stick by me," he said, "and you'll be all right." I was in a different world. All the men were wearing campaign ribbons, and they were so calm. They were real men. Real soldiers, and I felt elated to be amongst them. They were happy, cheerful and confident. I'm going to fast forward a little bit now to the actual landing, which goes as follows. We assembled on deck at 0330 hours. Ammunition for rifles and light machine guns was distributed. Grenades were issued and primed with 4-second fuses, 2 grenades to each man. Each man had a number 75 Hawkins anti-tank grenade to fasten to his belt. We had packs on our backs, as well as bags containing our gas masks. Corporal Stevenson checked that I was all right. He took my gas mask out and threw it overboard and filled the bag with more ammunition. "That'll be more use to you than a gas mask," he said. It was pitch dark. There were no lights on board, yet the soldiers moved around with confidence. Dawn was beginning to break as we climbed onto the landing craft, ready to be lowered onto the sea. The waves were running high, and I wasn't the only one who was beginning to wish that I hadn't eaten such a hearty breakfast. Until that moment, everything had happened in complete silence. As we left the mothership, bound for Gold Beach, King Red section, the naval guns started up. You can't see out of a landing craft. The sides are too high, but you can hear. And there's no words in the vocabulary that can describe the noise that morning. The whistle and explosions of shells, the roar of the rockets as they left the rocket ships, the sound of the waves and the men shouting through the megaphones, planes screaming overhead, appearing and disappearing within seconds. We didn't talk. Nobody would have heard us against that noise. I wasn't frightened, just very excited. Men around me were being sick, and the scuppers were full of vomit. I don't think I'd ever felt so ill in all my life. Then there was a grinding sound, and the craft hit the beach. The ramp dropped down almost immediately, and the men left in 2 lines. The craft was slipping back into the sea very slowly. I was behind the sergeant when the Marine put his arm in front of me. "Hold on a minute, son," he said, and the engine started and ran up onto the sand. I don't know what happened to the sergeant. He disappeared. I reckon the ramp must have run over him. He couldn't have got out of the way with all his kit. Then I was moving forward onto the French beaches. There was a landing craft coming in beside us, with an officer at the front with a megaphone reciting Henry V's speech at Agincourt. "Once more unto the breach, my dear friends." Listener, or was he actually saying, "Once more onto the beach, my dear friends"? I don't know. Shells were screaming overhead, and the naval guns were booming so that they echoed inside my head. I was running over the sand. It's strange how one's mind works, because I was thinking of the days I'd spent on the beach as a child. I was sure that sergeant had been killed, and it worried me. The beach was full of action. Men seemed to be running in all directions. The beachmaster was shouting through his megaphone. Then I saw the corporal signalling for us to make for the seawall. I couldn't hear him in all that din, but I understood the signals. I reached the seawall and leaned against it to regain my breath. Other soldiers were doing the same. That was when I realised that some of our men were absent. Looking back, I saw men lying on the sand. That gave me a shock. I hadn't realised we were being shot at. We wouldn't have heard the shots, not with all that noise. I started to look round, and I could hardly believe the sight in front of me. It was a hive of activity in every direction. Men were filing off landing craft and advancing up the beaches. LCTs, landing craft tanks, were on the tide line with their ramps open like huge gaping mouths. Tanks were beginning to trundle up the beaches. They had skirts on them to stop the water getting into their exhaust pipes, which they dropped as they came to the sand. Flail tanks were already at work, clearing the beaches of mines. One poor devil trod on a mine as he ran up on the beach and was blown to smithereens. Soldiers coming up behind him simply stepped over what had been a living being a few minutes before. We had been lucky. I'm fast-forwarding to the end of Dick's landing when he says, "We'd reached the village of Bressie by nightfall, somewhere short of our objective. Corporal Stevenson told us to dig in near some farm buildings. There were 10 men in our section, and 4 of us had survived. I discovered later that 10 officers and 85 other ranks from our regiment alone had perished on the beaches. The corporal told me to dig in front of the farm gates and shoot at anything that moved. I wouldn't have slept anyway. I was tired, but I was full of adrenaline. I hadn't eaten all day. I hadn't even taken my water bottle out. I'd drunk from streams or water butts. Not a very sensible thing to do, but when you're fighting, you don't think of sensible things. I took out my water bottle and took a long, cool drink of real English water. It was the best drink I've ever had in my life." Dick Bowen, 5th East Yorks. Listen, I'm going to leave it there. The rest of this bit of the memoir is great. If you want to catch up with the rest of it, listen to episode 45. Of course, one of Dad's comrades, Rufty Hill, was killed on the same beaches that Dick Bowen landed on, Gold Beach. I don't think Sergeant Hill is the same one as Dick referred to, because they were the same beach but different battalions, a different section of the beach. But nonetheless, it's fitting that this is a recording I made at the Bayeux War Cemetery a few years back when I went to pay my respects at Rufty's grave. And I'm hoping to get this episode out in time for Remembrance Sunday, Armistice Day. And I'm going to use this opportunity to pay my respects to all the soldiers who fought and died in battle, and join in spirit ceremonies taking place all over the world. So this is available as a video on my YouTube channel, link in the show notes as usual. But this is the audio version of it. It was a cool, rainy day, just as it would have been 80-odd years ago. I'm here in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, the British War Cemetery at Bayeux in France on the Normandy coast. I'm just here to pay my own little personal tribute to Rufty Hill, or Lance Sergeant William Allen Hill. He was killed on D-Day, and he was a pal of my dad's. And as he was getting off the landing craft, he jumped into a shell hole, disappeared under the water, and drowned. As he fell into the water, the landing craft surged forward on a wave, so he was probably crushed and obviously killed underneath that boat. But Dad described Rufty in the sense that he would have given a good account of himself had he lived. He was rough at the edges, but a great scrapper and a good tough soldier. It was a very sad loss to us all, as he'd always been a young man so full of energy, well known in the battalion and popular with everybody. So here I am in October 2017, just here to pay my own little tribute to him on the sort of day that was probably like this on D-Day in truth, wet and drizzly and a bit chilly. But nothing was too much trouble for Rufty. He was one of the lads, and it's awful to think that he'd survived from Dunkirk and Alamein to Enfid de Ville in Tunisia, fighting through in Sicily, only to be killed in such a tragic way, drowning while he was getting off the landing craft in the first wave of troops landing on D-Day. For us, war was a very bitter experience in life, my dad said. So, goodbye Rufty. Thank you for all your efforts. And we finished there with the last post, live from the very atmospheric Menin Gate in Ypres, Belgium. A bit of next episode news now. Survey responses from Chris Finn in Abergavenny, and he wants more stories from the old and bold. Chris Lake from Laceby, near Grimsby. Bill Cheel has to be the hero of this story. Without him, none of this would exist. Well, the next bit of news is dedicated to you, gents. Between now and Christmas, I'm going to offer a new episode for each chapter from Dad's entire book. It won't be a conventional show, it'll just be the chapters. It's going to be the full, unabridged version, but a bit more. I'm reviewing the bits I had to cut out when the book was first published because I had to get it down to a certain number of words. So hopefully, even if you've read Dad's book, there will be some new stuff. Call it the director's cut. So chapter 1 will be out in the next few weeks, and I'm going to follow on quickly with the following chapters, so you won't be waiting around for stuff to come out. All I ask is that you, if you listen to it and get value from this show, consider donating just $1 or $2 via Patreon or buy me a coffee, or via PayPal Direct via the link on my donation page. You'll find them on the website under the donate button, on the menu and elsewhere. In doing so, you'll be making a valued contribution towards the cost of running this show, like website, podcast hosting, recording equipment, transport, travel, sound effects, music licenses, books and old newspapers, as well as helping me to keep advertising to a minimum. So that's Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg, the best-selling WW2 memoir by Bill Cheel, the audiobook, on a podcast player near you, soon if not before, and it's free. It covers Dunkirk, North Africa, Sicily, D-Day First Wave and Germany, and includes Dad's roles as a Batman, dispatch rider, number 1 on the Bren, number 1 on the Mortar, wounded in action, policeman and officer's cook, and meeting Americans and Canadians, and Montgomery himself, well, nearly. All 6 years of one man's war. What more could you want? And I'll sum it up with this review I had years ago now, and it's a great, real, gritty history. You couldn't make this stuff up, and you don't need to. And that was from AW. Talking about supporting the show, many thanks are owed to the following subscribers who've kindly supported me with a regular monthly donation on Patreon. Dave Thomas, Chris Camfield, Brian McFeeters, Nancy Sarah Spencer, Amy Whitehead, Brian Grooters, Janice Blake, Devin Hupp, Greg Gluffrey, Harold Lowry, Nancy Spencer, Mark Johnson, Victor Weiser, Stephen Ginn, Mark Fowler, Richard Lord, Danny Fontenot, Dwayne Harris, Nigel Graham, Bondavinder Veshtin, Sean McLuhan, Jonathan Martin, Ruth Shermer, John Fromm, Ken Milligan, Gary North, Jared Stein, Dan Knuffel, John Peebles, Big E, David Edge, David Orrell and Andy Krieber. Thank you to all you people who've either now or in the past have donated regularly to this podcast, keeping the show on the road. And needless to say, many thanks to all those people who've made occasional fixed donations on Buy Me a Coffee, Buy Me a Galvados, Ko-fi, etc. Thank you so much. I just feel so proud and privileged that I've been on the journey I've been on, and that so many of you have shared it with me the way you have, and with multiple binge listens, superb reviews, wonderful feedback from wonderful people from all over the world, a chance to read first-hand memoirs, sometimes as one of just a handful of people in the entire world. I feel like we've been on a journey of discovery together, and I've sometimes only been a step ahead of you, sometimes a step behind. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the support and encouragement that you've given me. And I think it's time for some PSs. Here we go. This one's quite a long one, and it's about Brian Moss of 233 Company, the Royal Engineers. Brian has been a regular feature of this show right back from the early days, so it's right that he gets a bit of recognition for the superb book his son Mike Moss created from Brian's memoirs. Mines, Bombs, Bullets and Bridges, a Sappers Second World War diary, published through Pen and Sword. This is set in July 43 in Sicily, just after the Allies have landed and after the battle for the Primosoli Bridge has been fought on the Samito River. This chapter is headed Corridore del Perro. As for 233 Company, we in 2 Platoon turned off at Dead Horse Corner along a tree-shaded lane. It led eastwards towards the coast and finished up at Corridore del Perro, a rather splendid farmhouse set amongst vineyards almost on the shore and immediately adjacent to the mouth of the Leonardo. Within days we referred to the place as Vino Villa, a nickname that would persist throughout the remainder of the war. On the roof of the building was a viewing platform reached by a spiral wrought iron staircase set up against the north wall of the house and garlanded with vines. From the platform the most excellent views were obtainable of Etna, Primosoli and the road to Catania. I slept among the vines to the north of the building. I thought this farm would make a wonderful place for a holiday, if you didn't mind the mosquitoes that appeared at 6 p.m, biting all exposed skin and giving you malaria. It seemed that the mosquitoes at Vino Villa were larger than life and twice as vicious. It soon became apparent how important the bridge was to 50 Div. In the days to come, I was sent down there at frequent intervals to examine and report on one aspect or another. On my very first trip, I instructed the driver to go straight up to the bridge. The vehicle stopped and I got out. All was quiet apart from the normal pounding of our own guns and the occasional racing snarl of a Spandau that suddenly terminated, leaving only echoes. No sooner had I slammed the door of the truck than the driver quickly turned and drove off. I did not have time to ponder on this strange behaviour, since I heard a distant thud and became aware that a very large express train was coming through the sky directly towards me. I flung myself flat, just in time to witness the most impressive upflinging of earth and smoke, and for my ears to be assaulted by blast and noise. It was the big gun I'd heard about, the one that fired at all vehicles approaching the bridge. It had not missed the bridge by all that much either. That was the time of stardust and smoke gets in your eyes, the records. Smoke certainly did get in my eyes that morning. Today, if I hear the opening bar of Stardust, I'm back on the ridge to the south of that bridge again, looking north to the mountain. It was also the time of ripening grapes and bloated bodies of bright colours and terror in the vines. The thing which scared me most at that place was a pair of high-velocity guns which seemed to keep an eye open for any movement in the dry bed and oxbows of the Samito's serpentine curves. I never had time to ponder how it was that the Samito, which carried water, also possessed lengths and bends of dry bed. But it did, and our infantry sheltered there. Several times while visiting the infantry, I nearly died of fright as the two shattering explosions came suddenly amongst us with no warning whatsoever. Presumably the guns were located up on the slopes of Etna, firing down at us and able to some degree to get into our sheltered positions. We were learning something about that other war, the one of 1914 to 18, and we did not like it. Our lesson would last until 4th of August, when Kesselring would let us advance once more. Having been instructed to evacuate the island, the admirable Kesselring was meticulously preparing a demonstration of military withdrawal that is perhaps unparalleled. In due course he would safely carry across the Straits of Messina 60,000 German and 75,000 Italian troops, complete with their heavy equipment, tanks and guns. He would do it in the teeth of not only the Allies, but of his own colleagues too. But Kesselring had his way, and assembled such a force of flat guns at Messina that in daytime Allied aircraft did not dare to fly across the straits below 23,000 feet, nor would Allied naval craft put in an appearance. You can imagine how German sappers worked during the time the enemy held us at Catania. Overnight it became a sappers' war again. The big gun, which had just scared the daylights out of me, kept daily watch on the bridge. We never knew precisely where it lay, although I'm sure our gunners knew well enough. That morning, as I sprawled on the ground just short of Primasoli Bridge, listening hard for a second round from the big gun, it seemed to me that I was the tiniest of creatures at whom the gods were throwing their fire and lightning. At last all seemed clear, so I scrambled to my feet and scuttled onto the bridge. It was about 400 feet in length and built up of steel sections, riveted and bolted together. It was of a type known as a through bridge, since the road passed through it. The structure was composed of 2 deep frames, one on either side, connected with members across the top and the bottom, where the road-bearing beams were to be found. The roadway of the bridge was littered with the debris of war, and I picked my way carefully across to the other side. There was, as far as I could see, no sign of our men at all. Once behind the farm buildings, I became acquainted with the sunken lane and all its horrors. Back at the bridge, I inspected the structure in detail. I could see no major damage, so I gave it a clean bill of health. I could not say the same for my knees, which had taken another beating when I'd most recently dived to the ground. For the Sicilian adventure, we wore our desert clothing, shirt and shorts of khaki drill, KD, but this time our legs were bare. In the desert, we had also worn hose tops above our boots and a neatly wound putty just below the knee. For Sicily, hose tops were not issued, and the putty was wound just above the top of the boot, closing the junction of boot and leg. Our legs were therefore left mostly bare and were more of a target for mosquitoes and abrasions of all kinds. We did have KD longs, which were supposed to be worn in the evenings, but few people bothered. At the base of every man's shirt breast pocket was a yellow stain, and this came from his mecaprine anti-malarial tablets stored there until it was time for the next dose. I walked back to the company. The big gun did not speak again at that time. Evidently it was awaiting a more worthy target. It was generally believed that its gunners could not see the bridge itself, but that every morning they fired upon a building they could see 100 yards east of the bridge until they secured a hit, and then mathematically corrected their laying so as to zero in on the bridge. I would report each of my bridge inspections to Lieutenant Taylor, whose attitude to me made it clear that I was a creature of very little importance. On about the 20th of July, I learned that CRE wanted to find an alternative river crossing. The first I knew of this initiative was when Lieutenant Taylor instructed me to go and have a look and see what I thought about a bridge some 4,000 yards west of Primosoli Bridge. The fact that Taylor gave me the job seemed to indicate that Dick Betts, our platoon sergeant, was still in hospital. We did not see much of him in Sicily, although I know he was present a few days later. I set off in a truck, taking one sapper with me, almost certainly Andy Thomas. Eventually, I found the bridge of interest. At least I assumed it was the right bridge. It carried a road heading north for Catania, over the Samito, and it had already been blown. The truck driver, grinning widely, left us there and drove off. In no time at all, we found out why he was grinning. A covey of shells crashed down around our ears and kept us in a ditch until the vehicle was out of sight. The main problem with this bridge was that it was in clear view from enemy positions. Even its approaches could be seen. It was a nice design, a reinforced concrete bowstring arch in 2 spans, one of which was totally demolished. However, the piers and cross beams at the end of the demolished section were still intact. So I got out my 100-foot tape and we measured this and that, and I made notes and sketches. Luckily, our work was almost uninterrupted by the enemy gunners, who may have wanted us to rebuild it and give them a wonderful new target. Then we walked back to where our truck was waiting. Back at Vino Villa, I sought out paper, pens and ink from company office and drafted a report. It started something like this. The bridge at map reference 9125/6920 is a twin-span bowstring arch in reinforced concrete, one span of which has been demolished. I then went on to give general dimensions and to express the view that whereas a dry bailey could be pushed over successfully from the engineering point of view, the enemy artillery would make it totally impracticable and would destroy the work in no time flat. Nor could traffic use such a bridge in daylight. As an alternative, I suggested that a dry bailey be pushed over at a certain map reference, where a connection to the existing track was possible, and both the site and its approaches were masked from the enemy. I handed my report and sketches to Lieutenant Taylor. Next day, Major Osborne came to see me in 2 platoon lines. He said how much the report had been appreciated. I thought it was nothing special, just a normal engineering report, but they seemed to like it. From that moment, my relationship with Lieutenant Taylor changed for the worse. I began to suspect that he was avoiding me. Unfortunately, if so, it may have played a part in the way in which he was later killed. 69 Brigade had left the enemy in the Lentini area to the attention of others and had come forward into the line, relieving the Durham Light Infantry. 5th East Yorks occupied an area immediately north of the bridge I'd just reconnoitred, between that bridge and Catania Airfield. The airfield lay before them. To the left were the flood banks of the Samito and the railway bridge across the river. We soon realised that the enemy were using haystacks on the near side of the airfield for concealed mortar and machine gun positions. It appeared that these positions were actually inside the haystacks. Colonel James of 5th East Yorks asked if 2 platoon were prepared to set fire to the haystacks for him. That afternoon, we assembled a dozen 2-gallon water containers, new ones with the cap on a chain. We filled them with petrol and replaced the caps. We completed our arrangements with 2 turns of primer cord around each can, together with a detonator and a 20-minute time pencil. I detested time pencils because I considered them dangerous, but there was no other way. We tried out one of our explosive cans and it worked quite well, so we went off to 5th East Yorks as soon as it became dark. Johnny Halliday's No. 2 section of 2 platoon got the job and I went with them to see them off. Each man carried a can and a pair of pliers to crush his time pencil as they crept forward to the haystack assigned to them. No confrontation with the enemy developed. Possibly they may have occupied these positions only in daylight. All our men returned safely, except Sapper Foreman from Liverpool, who got lost and wandered about the airfield bawling, "Corporal Halliday!" at the top of his voice. Still, even Foreman returned to us in the end, and the time pencils did their job. At Vino Villa, we swam in the milk-warm Leonardo. One day I decided to try out an idea that had been simmering in my mind for some time. Using the respirator from a casualty, I took the corrugated rubber tube that fitted to the facepiece and connected the other end to a hollow bamboo pole. Then I put on the facepiece and held up the pole in one hand while taking a rock under the other arm. I walked into the river until I was fully submerged, inhaling through the pole and exhaling through the facepiece. Since all appeared well, I carried on across the river and emerged on the far side to the cheers of the lads. I must have played with this thing all afternoon, and I suspect that someone saw it and wrote into the Middle East HQ about it, since in 1953, at the crew office, a chap called Anderson told me that he was in Cairo in 1944, so that's like a year later, and saw a Middle East instruction recommending the very same thing. Oh dear, I thought there was going to be something more than just a toy in it, but obviously it did have its applications. As Dick Betts was spending so much time away from the platoon, something to do with his leg, I think, I began to think of 2 platoon more and more as my own. Ever since I'd volunteered to serve with 50 Div in June 42, I'd been super enthusiastic. You may judge my naivety then, since I really believed that the British Army was a wonderful establishment, all wise and incapable of making mistakes. Our army commander, who never appeared to put a foot wrong, undoubtedly influenced me in this belief. Under Monty, I never felt that the enemy stood a chance, and coupled with my own enthusiasm, this state of mind resulted in a relatively high state of morale, despite being scared to death now and then. At this time, I was inspecting Primasoli Bridge on a daily basis, and since nothing had happened to it, I was oddly surprised when I received a message to the effect that it had been hit. I found the site totally deserted when I dashed off down there but the bridge had certainly been hit. Not far from mid-span, an awful gap had been torn in the roadway. Steel members were bent up 10 feet into the air at either end of the gap, rather like the petals of a flower. It seemed to me that the shell must have passed through the roof girders without touching them, penetrated the roadway, and then at a level of about 4 feet below the roadway had exploded, blasting the roadway upwards. What a mess! I quickly examined the all-important side frames and found no damage that bothered me. The enemy had prevented us from using the bridge, but had not really damaged it. How lucky we were! Obviously, the first thing to do was to cut away the bent and twisted members. When that was done, perhaps a small box girder, SBG, bridge could be put over the gap, a bridge within a bridge, so to speak. I raced back to Vino Villa and reported that we needed oxyacetylene cutting gear that night. It was delivered that afternoon from 235 Field Park Company, and I loaded it upon a 1,500-weight truck in such a way that it could be used without removing it from the truck. When it became dark, I set off with 6 men, one of whom was Lance Corporal Henry Newing of Reading, Berkshire. He was our platoon blacksmith and would direct the use of the cutting gear. All was quiet at the bridge. I directed the truck to reverse onto the structure so that we could make a quick getaway if the need arose. We dealt with the debris at the far end of the gap first, the tubes I'd ordered reaching that far. The job took longer than I had expected, since some of the sections were thick and heavy. It was an eerie job. The hissing, brilliant flame, the men holding ground sheets so that the enemy would not see the glaring arc, and each man listening hard for the distant thud, which would tell us that the big gun knew what we were doing. Cut-off members splashed down into the dark water, and to me the job seemed to be taking far too long. At length it was finished, and I sent the team to start clearing the other end of the gap, while I examined what had already been completed. When I rejoined them, we suddenly had an emergency. One lad, I can't remember who, had held his shielding ground sheet too close to the flame, and now the whole sheet was ablaze. "Drop it!" I hissed, and it fell in flames into the water. Newing, the sensible chap, had immediately extinguished his torch, and we crouched there, holding our breath. However, we were lucky, and nothing happened. We got on with the job and finished it. The truck and the men were sent off the bridge, and I did a final check. If an SBG were installed, it would have to be considerably longer than the gap in order to distribute the end loads over as many road bearers as possible. I thought we might have to downgrade the load classification of the bridge too. When I'd first viewed the damage to the bridge, I had clambered along the eastern side frame and measured the extent of the gap. It was 32 feet 6 inches. Many years later, I realised this was 10 metres. The road bearer beams would probably have been at 1 metre centres. I think I would have installed a 48-foot 4-girder bridge, but it would not have been Class 40 anymore. As things happened, I had nothing to do with the putting over of the SBG. Someone else did it. And in any case, a few days later, an Army Field Company put in an appearance and pushed over a dry bailey 100 yards upstream, easing the situation enormously. Back at Vino Villa one day we became aware of a battery of 4 guns 1,000 yards to our west that had opened fire. From our observation platform on the roof, we could see their shells airbursting over the road to Catania. We listened to the noisy passage of the ponderous shells through the sky and watched their gigantic bursts occurring long before the sound of their passage had expired. These guns were effectively enfilading the road, and as far as we could tell, their target was the point where the road crossed the Botcheco ditch. Their shells must have scraped over the top of the bridge, between them and their target. The shells were airbursting black, like 88 bursts, and I wondered if they were captured 88s, because our 3.7s airbursted white. Whatever these guns were, they worried the enemy, because the big gun took a hand. From our observation platform, we watched the efforts of the big gun to find this battery, which was invisible to them behind the ridge. The big gun knew that our battery was located somewhere on the projected line of the Catania road and searched blindly along it. Although no shell dropped nearer than half a mile from the battery, it was interesting to watch their efforts. At this time I became much more involved in the day-to-day running of the platoon. This derived from 2 considerations. First was the frequent absence of Dick Betts, who could not get his leg properly repaired in Sicily. He would leave us soon, and not return until 1944, when he came back as No. 3 Platoon Sergeant. The second factor was the attitude of Lieutenant Taylor. His driver was a chap of almost 40 years of age, named Hunt. To us, Hunt seemed like a grandfather. He wore a forage cap placed centrally upon his head, and then pulled right down so that the top opened out and became flat, giving a most odd appearance. One day, Hunt came over to me and confided, "Sarge, he's going to get us both killed." "Who, Taylor?" I asked. It seemed that Lieutenant Taylor was wandering all over Sicily, taking all kinds of risks totally unconnected with the business of the platoon. According to Hunt, he also had no idea of the risks he was running. Thus far in Sicily, the word mine had not been used. The enemy had been given no time to prepare any surprises for us. If there had been mines at Primosoli, then Hunt's words would have been more meaningful. At this time, our commanders began to think that the enemy was on the point of withdrawal, so we moved into the positions of 5th East Yorks, ready for the advance. So I said goodbye to Primosoli Bridge. It's been said that the bridge was hit on several occasions, but I know of only one solid hit. Perhaps there'd been other glancing blows of no consequence. The grimy old structure had served its purpose, one which its designers could never have dreamed of. It had allowed 50 Div to be supported over the river in those critical early days when Kesselring was still of the opinion that the island could be held, and the Allies ejected. His view seemed reasonable enough on the 10th and 11th of July, when Patton's 7th Army was very nearly slung back into the sea. After all, if the few German troops could hold us as they did in front of Catania, imagine what another 6 or 9 mobile and panzer divisions could have done. Our commanders were right. Jodl had decided to withdraw on July the 15th, and Kesselring issued the order on August the 2nd. On the following day, Our infantry were in the Botacheco ditch. Listener, that's it from Brian Moss, and I have to say, I just love his detailed explanations of his technical exploits. He first came to fame, in my humble opinion, for his destruction of the anti-tank ditch a few months earlier in Tunisia at the Battle of Wadi Akarit. That's episode 2. Yes, all that time ago. That allowed the Allies into the mountains to attack the defending enemy at a crucial moment in the battle. And here we are, witnessing another brilliant piece of strategic engineering to open up the roads so that the Allies could travel through. PS2. You'll recall earlier on in this episode my spotting some sort of code at the top of the Evening Dispatch newspaper, the one dated 6th of June 1944, and at the top it said, "Code letter for tonight," and that was a big capital A. What was that about? All is about to be revealed thanks to Bing. Apparently, during World War II, newspapers in the UK printed a code letter at the top of the front page as part of a system to communicate with the British resistance in case of a German invasion. The system was designed to provide covert instructions to resistance fighters, and the code letter would change daily and correspond to a pre-arranged set of instructions. For example, a specific letter might indicate that resistance members should prepare for immediate action or move to a new location. This method ensured that even if traditional communication lines were cut, the resistance could still receive vital information through a seemingly innocuous part of the daily newspaper. I've put some useful code-breaking links in the show notes, which you might find interesting or useful to sharpen your talents on wartime code-breaking. Righto, here's the final PS, and I'll remind you that Brian Moss, in the early days of the war as an engineer, was a sapper dismantling bombs in 1940s Blitz blackout London. And this is just an outtake of part of the script that I was using at the time. I don't think I've played it anywhere else. If I have, I apologise, but it's a bit of a giggle. And here we go. The lone toilet at the end of the corridor outside was busy all night while bombs fell and anti-aircraft guns thundered all around us. Sorry. I'm just trying to imagine that scene. Oh, God. I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now.